Vesica Health has translated 20 years of advanced multi-omic research in bladder cancer detection into well-validated, clinically actionable tests that improve the evaluation of hematuria and the early detection of bladder cancer. Their mission is to transform the diagnosis and management of bladder cancer, helping physicians identify hematuria patients at increased risk for bladder cancer who may benefit from immediate referral to urology and clinical evaluation. Their patented, non-invasive, urine-based AssureMDx test also helps physicians accurately distinguish hematuria patients at very low risk for bladder cancer who may safely avoid invasive procedures. To speak on this, we have CEO Christopher Thibodeau, who holds a 2017 to 2017 Stanford University Graduate School of Business.
It was a program I did that. I'll introduce myself.
Okay, I'm excited to hear this. And this is a big point. I can't tell you the number of people that come in with stage 4 bladder or stage 4 renal, and I'm just wondering why the primary doctor, they'll scope them every which way and in their ears for blood loss, but never checked a UA. And it's really hard on me to just say you could have done a UA, and then finding a urologist is challenging depending on the community and where you live. So getting a cystoscopy is not as easy, and it's just not easy to find on imaging. And I'm sure you're going to say all that. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself. Yeah.
Appreciate that. As the doctor pointed out, I'm Chris Thibodeau. I'm the CEO of Vesica Health, and I'm excited to be here. And again, thank you to Chad and the entire CAGLA team for the invitation to present. It's a great honor to be here and excited about the entire program and this illustrious group of people that have been presenting today. So it's my pleasure. I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about what we're doing at Vesica Health and specifically how we can improve the early detection of bladder cancer and overall survival. So we'll talk more about that. A little backdrop on the company. We like to think that we're in a very unique position. We're an advanced stage company in terms of clinical development, product development, and clinical validation, yet we're really focused right now on our seed stage round, right? So we're just starting the company. We've got in our back pocket 20 different studies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals over the last decade or so, and 3 clinical validation studies in our primary indication, which the first one that we'll bring to market is here in hematuria. Which we were just discussing. And we'll talk more about the clinical dilemma or the challenges associated with bladder cancer. But our team, which I'll tell about at the end, we have combined over 25 years of experience, myself probably about 28, in this space, focused specifically in cancer diagnostics. Excuse me. And as I said, we've got a variety of, we've got, a very large market opportunity, which is why we're really excited about improving patient outcomes in this arena, because I think it's an underserved population in a variety of different ways. We haven't seen an improvement in overall survival in bladder cancer for nearly 30 years. And so there's a lot of room for improvement, and we've got a great solution to help address that particular need. We demonstrate substantially better performance than any of the other current interventions or diagnostic measures that are out there today. And we'll talk more about that with some comparison data. And then as I mentioned, we've got 20-year peer-reviewed publications. And this is a technology that's been around for quite some time. If any of you were at the keynote address this morning, Amir Ali from Guardant was talking about the focus in epigenetics. Well, we've been focused in epigenetics for a long time. And the backbone of this assay is actually our 3 proprietary epigenetic biomarkers that help us really identify patients earlier with greater sensitivity than the other types of tests that are out there. So we'll talk more about that. Recurrence monitoring is an exciting area. We've actually done 7 studies in this area, but we've not done the final clinical validation for recurrence monitoring with the final assay configuration of the 6 biomarkers. So that's something we'll be doing with use of proceeds as we get started. And then later, as we're up and running, there are some unique opportunities and a lot of discussion among the urology community, specifically in the academic setting, about how do we better address patients at risk for bladder cancer. Now, you heard a lot of folks talk today about the challenges of access and screening on a whole. We're not proposing to get into the cancer screening market yet because we're not one of those 5. Bladder cancer is not one of the 5 cancers that Medicare can cover as a screening indication. But it is an area where we can identify patients far sooner by virtue of the fact they present with hematuria. And we're going to get into that. But beyond that, we have a lot of, I think last estimate when I was doing some work in lung cancer, there's about 90 million former and current smokers, 45 million each about. And those are the primary risk patients, right, that have that smoking history, which is the leading cause of bladder cancer. And so we could look at a high-risk population of patients with 30-pack years of smoking and presenting with hematuria. So it's not truly a screening, but it is an intervention with that population of patients that could really help us identify them earlier and get them intervention when there's the greatest opportunity for cure. All right, the backdrop here. Hematuria is prevalent. It's estimated that 1 in 5 adults will present with hematuria at any given time during the year. Now, there are a lot of causes for hematuria, so it's not readily apparent that this is a bladder cancer or renal carcinoma or anything of that nature. It could be a UTI. It could be that they're on statins. It could be a variety of contributing factors that lead to a patient presenting with hematuria. And so the guidelines are pretty clear. What do? Well, we follow those patients and we test them repeatedly with urinalysis, potentially urine cytology, and we try to see whether or not that hematuria dissipates or goes away. When we have persistent hematuria, meaning it's just presenting and it's not going away and there's no known cause, we can look at other risk factors. Are they over 50 years of age? Bladder cancer is more frequently found in men, about 70% of the time, than women. However, we're going to talk about this in a minute, women often are diagnosed at much later stages, and we'll talk about why. So the opportunity here, the guidelines state that patients with both intermediate and or high risk presentation should be referred to urology for clinical evaluation. And that's important because today, only about 12% of patients are getting referred to urology for evaluation. And as a consequence, we're missing 20,000 cancer cases per year, bladder cancer cases. And more than that, when we are finding cancer, we're finding it at much later stages than necessary because we're not finding it early when there's the greatest opportunity to treat them. And so when we look at that, when you're diagnosed with later stage disease, your chances for survival drop precipitously. For instance, if you're found with localized superficial disease, so those little superficial bladder tumors, carcinoma in situ, or sometimes called TIS, your survival at 5 years is 95%. However, if it progresses into the muscle layer, and worse, if it progresses outside, to distant sites, your survival drops to about 38% at 5 years. So really, the challenge here is that most patients are not being found early enough to actually intervene and treat them. And it's exciting today, if we look across the landscape, there are a lot of new immunotherapies coming out. Janssen's got some immunotherapy targeting early stage bladder cancer. CG Oncology just went IPO a few weeks ago, and they've got a really, really novel immunotherapy for early stage non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. And there's another company out in California called Immunity Bio, and they've got an early intervention. But there are a lot of other treatments too that have been around for quite some time, BCG therapy and others, apart from just surgical resection, which is effective for early stage disease as well. The challenge, and that's why we focus on recurrence for the future, is the challenge with a lot of patients diagnosed with early stage disease is that there's a 50 to 70% rate of recurrence. And so those patients are monitored quite aggressively for the first several years after their first treatment. Because of that rate of recurrence, they get cystoscopy every 3 months for the first 2 years. And that's a very invasive procedure, which we'll talk about here. So our goal really is to identify a better way to diagnose cancer prior to even helping refer them into urology for that more thorough workup. But also reducing the unnecessary procedures on patients that have little or no risk of harboring bladder cancer. I mentioned earlier that this is kind of a women's health issue. Although women maybe account for about 30% of bladder cancer cases, I don't know if it's still in the top 10 of cancers for women. They often present, as I said earlier, at later stages of disease, and that's a result of the lack of proper guideline adherence in the primary care setting or in the gynecology setting. Often these patients require 2 to 3 additional visits prior to referral to urology, and therefore they're diagnosed with more advanced disease and they have a greater risk of mortality associated with that disease. So we do recognize that there's an opportunity here across the spectrum, really, for men and women to improve early detection and diagnosis. I mentioned earlier that the standard of care in the urology setting, once they arrive, they're going to continue. They'll probably repeat urinalysis, which is a dipstick test to see if there's blood in the urine. They might send out for urine cytology, which is pathology review of a slide of the urine sample, which is notoriously poor in terms of sensitivity. It's a 50-50, answer on whether or not you have cancer. If you have cancer, it's highly specific. They see it morphologically. They see the cancer cells. But if it's negative, it doesn't mean you don't have cancer. It means that they just didn't find it. Now, when we talk about cystoscopy, this is the primary tool of urologists in determining whether or not a patient has bladder cancer. And, there are a couple of different ways that we can help address the management of patients in this arena, but one of which is, we don't necessarily have to replace cystoscopy. It's a valuable tool to evaluate or to examine the bladder wall and the urethra. The challenges are that it's only 76% sensitive for all malignancies. And in fact, it only picks up about 55% of carcinoma in situ, those early stage superficial tumors, really the ones we want to find because it's most treatable at that stage. So as a consequence, when patients are actually having a negative cystoscopy, the same risk applies. Did we miss it? Did we not see it? And so those patients are going to be referred on for probably a CT scan in 59% of the cases. And we'll talk about that momentarily. But here we know that, close to 800,000 patients per year in the US get a cystoscopy procedure. But the vast majority of them actually don't have bladder cancer. And so there's an opportunity here to improve the care of patients, avoid some of these very invasive procedures. But in the setting where a urologist still chooses to do cystoscopy, that's fine. Right? They're accustomed to that. They've had experience with it. They can identify patients that do have cancer. But for instance, when they don't see cancer, could be a risk of upper tract disease in the ureters, also called urothelial carcinoma. It can present up in those ureters where the cystoscopy cannot access. And that's why I mentioned often they're going to be referred out for a CT scan. The problem with CT scans, and these are widely used both in the primary care setting and in the urology setting. And obviously, we all are familiar with CT scans. Some of us in this room may have had them before. They are seemingly harmless, but they're not. I remember reading an article many years ago, over a decade ago, talking about that having a CT scan it equates to being within 3 miles of the Hiroshima bomb when it dropped. So there is risk of radiation exposure, and as the literature states, there's a 1 in 174 patient risk of developing a secondary cancer resulting from that CT scan. So as we look at, there's a couple of papers that are out recently talking about the harms and risks associated with the AUA guidelines that we refer patients for a CT scan after negative cystoscopy. The yield of new cancers identified is 0.2%. So as a result, they suggest that there's a 5 to 10 time increase in the number of cancers caused than are actually found in the upper tract, the ureters. So it's not a perfect solution, and we get that, but it's what they've had up until the present. Now, the other part of CT scan, because there's so few cancers actually identified, the incremental cost per new diagnosis is about $1 million. So use of CT scan really is a great health economic opportunity for us to replace that, or at least intervene following negative cystoscopy, provide a non-invasive urine sample, run the biomarkers. If it's positive, sure, refer on for CT scan or do another cystoscopy procedure to see if you missed something. But at a minimum, we could really dramatically reduce the use of CT in this population, reduce cost, and reduce that harmful radiation exposure. So what do we do? What is our solution? And I mentioned that we've done over 20 studies. The technology is an epigenetic technology. It's a combination of 3 epigenetic biomarkers and 3 somatic mutations. But the beauty of it is we take it from a urine sample. We heard Cardin talk this morning about blood-based biomarkers, liquid biopsies. Often we're all familiar with tissue-based assays, which are valuable when you actually identify the tumor and you can take a tumor biopsy. But in this setting, we're talking about identifying patients prior to a diagnosis of cancer and then potentially manage them after treatment to see if there's a cancer recurrence. And so we don't have the tumor to biopsy per se if we're looking at just more of an evaluation at that stage. So it's a non-invasive approach. We've done, as I said, all the research and discovery, the 3 clinical validation studies. I'll touch on those momentarily. We delivered very high sensitivity and specificity for the identification of those patients in terms of both early stage and late stage disease. And we're actually just wrapping up presently our health economics. It's not completed yet, but we did build the budget impact model, and now we're putting all the data inputs into it. And there's some really great literature coming out, some new studies talking about the total cost of care by stage of bladder cancer. It is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most expensive cancers to diagnose. There's a paper by Halpern et al. A couple years ago, cost effectiveness of screening for bladder cancer, and it estimates that it's about $53,000 per diagnosis. So again, not the individual, but on a whole, with all the screening methodologies out there, we're spending about $53,000 to find each bladder cancer case. And we all recognize that that's still imperfect because we're missing cancer cases and patients are diagnosed too late. So lots of opportunities for improvement. What we provide is with a non-invasive assay is the opportunity to triage these patients early. Patients who are found to have our biomarkers positive have a 5-fold increase of harboring bladder cancer compared to the average patient being referred for evaluation based on the AUA guidelines. And we have a negative test, meaning none of the biomarkers are positive. We have a 99.8 negative, I think it's greater than 99% negative predictive value. In certain patient populations, it's actually 99.8. So really giving patients greater peace of mind as to the fact that they can avoid those invasive procedures. You've heard a couple of people talk about it today, so I won't reiterate too much unless you have questions after the fact. But we're initially going to launch the product as an LDT, a laboratory-developed test. It does not require FDA approval to bring to market. We will go through the CLIA CAP validation process, and in fact, we're currently working with our laboratory. It's an incubator model in Southern California, where we'll be bringing the product to market in the next 2 months. So we expect to have the test up and running and available for an early access program that will start off in April of this year. And then we'll continue to do some additional studies with different investigators at different sites. Even though the test is clinically validated, there's a lot of opportunities to do little subset studies and investigator-initiated studies that we think will be interesting and add to the story. I mentioned here that it's a well-proven epigenetic technology, and I can tell you personally that I was involved in working with the folks at Exact Sciences back in 2010 when I was part of the team there at MDX Health, where we outlicensed the technology. We outlicensed our colon cancer screening program and the biomarkers to Exact Sciences, and one of those biomarkers serves as the backbone of the Cologuard assay. So these are very similar technologies. We're just using different biomarkers, but the same epigenetic approach that they use in the Cologuard assay. They're looking at stool, we're looking at urine, and it allows us to deliver that great sensitivity. But there are other biomarkers out there. MDX Health has their prostate cancer test called Confirm MDX. LabCorp has an assay called MGMT, which is for glioblastoma. So there are a variety of different biomarkers out there that are utilizing this epigenetic technology. And as Amir Ali said this morning, it really is an exciting area in cancer to look at those changes, the on-off switch of these genes that then can either lead to cancer or other cell differentiation and positive outcomes too. But in cancer, obviously, DNA methylation or epigenetics is an important area for not only diagnosis but treatment. So we've got a great library of publications on the genes and the technology. We've consistently shown in 3 prospective clinical validation studies that we have very high area under the curve, as compared to some of those early, what do we call them, the early stage liquid biopsy biomarkers for cancers. We're delivering very, very high sensitivity, 96% for early stage disease as well as late stage disease. And as I mentioned earlier, a very high negative predictive value to give patients greater peace of mind. One of the recent studies we just published last year was just comparing our assay to the AUA guidelines for hematuria patients. And again, we're not disputing the AUA guidelines. We want to augment those guidelines in that patients presenting with intermediate and high-risk disease, which accounts for the vast majority of the hematuria patients, should have clinical evaluation so we can improve upon survival in bladder cancer. Well, we showed that we could augment that substantially, reduce the vast majority of unnecessary referrals. I think we argued that we could, the authors argued that we could reduce unnecessary cystoscopy by greater than 55%. But also really identify those patients who would benefit most from early referral and early intervention. This is just one of our clinical validation studies. I won't go into all of them, but this is a large prospective study on 838 patients. Looked at all comers, both patients presenting with gross or visible hematuria, meaning you could visibly see the blood in the urine, as well as microhematuria, which is undetectable or non-visible hematuria, which is typically detected by urinalysis in the doctor's office by basic testing, just urinalysis. The reason I broke it out separately is just because the AUA guidelines recommend that all these patients with gross hematuria get immediately referred. They're high risk. Get them into urology. They need to be evaluated. Now, we could still address that population. There's a 20% risk of harboring bladder cancer when you have gross hematuria. We can address that probably better than cystoscopy, but at the same time, we're not trying to change the standard of care, but improve the standard of care. But if we can identify those patients and get them in sooner, obviously there's a big advantage for early detection. But also in the microhematuria population, this is kind of the unknown land. It's the vast majority of hematuria patients, and the primary care doctors and we can see this in literature, we can see it in the studies, and the urology community recognizes this. We don't know what to do with these patients. The guidelines make suggestions, but nobody adheres to the guidelines, or at least very few do. And so we're looking for better tools, better means to get these patients in for evaluation and treated sooner. And this test delivers. It was on about half the cohort, an area under the curve of 0.97, very high sensitivity, very high negative predictive value. If we look at the areas under the curve here, we have an opportunity to not only identify those at low risk, but also identify those at an increased risk, substantially increased risk. So both the best of both worlds in terms of delivering, actionable information to the primary care doctor and or the urologist in terms of managing that patient. How are we doing on time here? Got a few minutes left. All right, very good. So again, when we look at the landscape, there are biomarkers out there. There have been biomarkers out there for many, many years. 20 years ago, Abbott introduced a test called Eurovision. It's 4 targeted biomarkers. They're called fluorescent in situ hybridization. It's a technology that's widely used in diagnostics. But the challenge with that test is it doesn't actually improve upon the standard of care, being cystoscopy. So, despite its relative use, 200,000, we estimate about 200,000 cases per year based on Medicare and third-party data. It's only scratching the surface of the total patient population that could be addressed. And the reason for that really is it's just not delivering that level of performance that would, give urologists the confidence to avoid cystoscopy. So what we have is an opportunity here to bring substantially better performance than the current standard of care and other biomarkers on the market. And it's been extensively validated. So we feel confident with those results, and we continue to generate data, as we always will, with our investigators across the U.S. The total addressable market is much, much larger, but if we want to narrow that down to what we think is the serviceable addressable market, it's about 8 million patients per year that would benefit from this test. These are patients with persistent hematuria that could get referred into urology. Out of that 17 million, it's a subpopulation of that. We do know that about 1.8 million patients will get a CT scan even before getting a referral to urology, which is unnecessary and inappropriate, because ultimately we could have the urologist make that decision following cystoscopy whether or not the patient needs a CT scan. But then even those 2 million patients that are referred to urology, where we could better triage them and get the right patients in to see a urologist, because right now it's kind of a bit of a crapshoot. Some patients get referred, some patients don't get referred, and at the end of the day, we're not really improving the outcomes. Inside urology, we know that estimate about 780,000 patients will get cystoscopy, but only about 83,000 bladder cancer cases are diagnosed each year. So again, in that particular scenario, there's an opportunity to improve the management of those patients. And then, as I mentioned, in urology, about 59% of the patients who undergo or referred to urology will ultimately get a CT scan as well. So that's an area, a big niche of about 1.2 million patients where I think we could really make a substantial improvement, not only in the cost, but the outcomes for those patients. And then again, we talked earlier about recurrence monitoring. There's about 600,000 patients living with a prior diagnosis of bladder cancer, and they're managed very, very closely. And we're not proposing that we would replace all the current management of those patients, but we could really extend the interval between that invasive cystoscopy procedure and hopefully identify patients that are recurring much, much sooner so that they can get the right intervention. So overall, very large market opportunity, significant unmet need with a solution that really delivers much better performance. Our commercial strategy, I've been in the space, as I mentioned, for about 25 years. I started off with a company called Ventana Medical Systems, then got into the lab services business where we built labs and we actually did commercial testing for hospitals and clinics around the U.S. That company was ultimately acquired by Lab Corporation America, and I was able to lead their oncology team for a couple of years. So we really have an understanding of how to bring these products to market and how to leverage and utilize channel partners. So I've had a lot of dialogue with the folks at a variety of different companies about the potential opportunity once we've secured Medicare coverage to make this available through some of these channel partners and potentially even some licensing agreements where, for instance, if we talk to some of the larger IDNs, integrated distribution networks, whether it's the Kaisers and the Mayos of the world or other institutions or EPMCs that are very large, they may not want to send a test out to a laboratory like ours, but we might be able to do a license agreement and actually put the test into their laboratory to improve the care of their patient population and reduce their overall costs. We are talking about, in talking to a number of different particular manufacturers in terms of exploring an IVD kit. That's a little bit longer term, but there's an opportunity, just like I mentioned with the hospitals, if we could provide a kit that's turnkey and they can use it. In the urology community, we've got the academic setting, which are the big hospital institutions we could partner with, but also there's a phenomenon that's occurred over the last 10 to 15 years where a lot of the urology groups have come in the community practice have come together and formed these mega groups. Those are called LUGPAs, and we have an opportunity. We've worked with them in the past at different companies to do agreements with them and provide testing for their patient populations. And a lot of them have their own laboratories. So again, with a kit, there are a lot of opportunities. And then lastly, at my former company, a company called MDX Health, who operates in the urology space, we had a pretty broad reach in Europe as well, where we provided kits to different hospital systems throughout Europe for performing the test as well. So there are a lot of neat opportunities in terms of how we can expand market and clinical adoption. Our focus initially would be, let's get the product to market. We're going to go after gaining Medicare coverage through the MolDX program initially. Then we will also expand beyond that and concurrently look at the Veterans Affairs Hospital System. We'll look at the IDNs. We'll look at private insurance and bringing those contracts in. I've managed teams at previous companies to do that. So we understand the landscape and how to get it done. We're not going to do a full-scale commercial launch until we've secured or at least have great line of sight on Medicare. Typically, that can take 12 to 18 months, but there might be some paths to get there quicker based on, previous coverage of Eurovision that's been out there for 20 years. We're looking for a comparable price point of about $750 a test, which will deliver great health economics, but it really puts us on parity with cystoscopy, with other biomarkers, and with CT scan, about the same price point. So we won't increase the cost, but based on our superior performance, we can really reduce the overall cost of diagnosis. And importantly, if we can improve the early detection of bladder cancer, we can dramatically reduce the need for a lot of those very, very expensive therapeutics that occur in the stage 3 and stage 4 setting, including cystectomy and other, immunotherapies. Where are we? Well, I mentioned earlier for our hematuria indication, we've completed our clinical validation, we've completed product development, and we're now doing the technology transfer as we speak with our incubator lab. I mentioned incubator lab because it's an established CAP-CLIA laboratory. They've done this before with other companies where we actually are operating in a pod model. We don't have to outlay the capital to get the test up and running. We utilize their technology, and they charge us for using their equipment. They provide staff and management, and we pay them to operate and manage our test for the interim until we're at a time where we know we have Medicare, and then we'll build out our own commercial laboratory. So we'll be launching soon with an early access program. We'll do comparative effectiveness with a clinical utility study. We're talking to several academic groups in California to conduct that study this year. And then we'll start driving clinical adoption and payer adoption through just normal channels and demonstrating the efficacy of the assay and improve patient outcomes. Let's see here, wrapping up a couple minutes here. We've got an experienced management team I didn't mention, but I think it's the next slide. I'll bounce forward for 1 second. Myself, I've been in this space for 28 years. Laura Saba, who's actually joined as our president and co-founder, she started off with Janssen, working in the area of urology. She came over to my former employer, MDX Health, many years ago. She'll remain a consultant to MDX Health, but she's joining us full-time as of January. And she's just spent a lot of time designing and conducting clinical trials with a lot of the leading academic centers, both in the U.S. and Europe. And she's got a lot of experience with this particular assay. We both started working on it back in early 2010 to 2013. So she's been part of the story since the beginning, and we out-licensed this test from MDX Health, our former employer. Will Lawrence, who is a leading academic in bladder cancer, he's now down in South Carolina, Bon Secours. He was previously a professor of urology at Huntsman Cancer Institute. He's got a phenomenal pedigree, and he's currently the chair of the AUA guideline committee for advanced prostate cancer. So he's a very well-connected person within the academic community, and we're just so fortunate to have him on our team to help us drive the clinical trials design and the market adoption of the assay. And then Manuel Crispin, we actually got him from a company called Epigenomics out of Berlin. He had migrated to the U.S. He's got his PhD in epigenetics, and this has been his whole life working in epigenetics. And he actually helped us design our assay and is helping us get the test up and running in our new laboratory. Just backtracking for a moment, like I said earlier, we're a later stage company in terms of experience, in terms of clinical validation, and the product development phase, but we're currently focusing on our seed round to get the lab up and running, which is in progress right now with funds we've raised so far. and get submitted for Medicare coverage, which I mentioned could take 6 months to 18 months. And really that's when we would target doing a larger round, our Series A, and going full bore once we have Medicare coverage established. The value proposition is just a well-differentiated assay with superior performance to anything on the market, well-defined medical need, great clinical support among the urology community. In fact, several of our early investors are actually academic urologists who really believe in the story and the clinical need for this test. And then lastly, just wrapping up some of the loose ends here, we started having dialogue with a lot of the academics who are involved in setting the guideline committees back in 2016, 2017, to really understand what types of studies they wanted to see, what kind of data we needed to generate so that we could prove that the test would be a viable solution for patient care. And those guidelines, hopefully in the next year or two, will start to get updated, and we have a great opportunity to be well positioned for inclusion. So again, if you have any questions, I'll be here throughout tomorrow, happy to answer them. And we welcome any dialogue, and those interested in investing, we'd love your support. So thank you again to everyone.